Hello, and welcome to the Mighty Oaks Show today. Good to have you with us. Thank you for watching and or listening. And if this is your first time with us, appreciate you taking the time to join this conversation. And as I do every week when we begin, I want to start by saying this. If you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do that. YouTube is a place for us to put so much content. We have testimonials there. We have information that can be helpful to you and those that you care about. We have this show and other shows. So if you have not yet, subscribe there, hit the notification bell. That lets you know when more content comes online. And we'd love to share all of that with you. If you are listening to the podcast or over at Mojo, again, thank you for listening, but take some time after the episode to go over to YouTube and subscribe there, and that would be awesome. We work very, very hard every week to put out as much good content for you as we possibly can. And we do that for you, so please take advantage of that. Leave a comment if you want to, share it out, and we'd love to connect with you there. Looking forward to our conversation today. Today we have in studio, which in these days of COVID is a little bit unusual, but have an in-studio guest. Nole Lilley is with us. And Nole, thanks for coming all the way down from Crestline. Live in Crestline?
I live in Crestline. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Awesome to be here.
For those that aren't from here, that's a little ways away.
Yeah, San Bernardino is our closest city, so it's in the mountains above San Bernardino, close to Lake Arrowhead, if you know that area.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for coming down and talking. We'll just jump into it. I've got a lot to say.
Yeah.
But Nole, you served in the United States Army.
I did.
For a number of years. We'll talk about that. 1st Ranger Battalion.
Yes.
Which is awesome. Now you serve as a Los Angeles County firefighter. And here in California, that's a big deal. It's funny, you talk to people who live in other states that don't deal with wildfires the way we do here in California, and the fire service it's just a different thing.
Yeah, it's a totally different animal, especially if the further east you get, it seems like out in the Midwest, a lot of departments are volunteer.
Yeah.
So it's a totally different animal.
Yeah.
Those guys are doing the same work and doing a great job.
And they do an incredible job.
Yeah.
But it's just, we're just talking about the wildfires here right now through our state. I think we've had more than 3 million or something acres burned this year.
I believe it's a record of all time.
Absolutely incredible.
In 1 year,
Yeah, so thanks for what you're doing, and we'll talk about that as well. The first responder community is a community that Mighty Oaks Foundation is serving and has, and we're leaning into that. So I want to talk more about that as well. But let's start at the beginning. Your bio says, first line, I was raised at Hume Lake Christian Camp. And for those that are connected to kind of the Christian community, the Christian world, particularly on the West Coast, Hume Lake is a big deal. I mean, thousands of particularly kids and teenagers have gone through there. Talk about that and then carry us through.
Yeah, so Hume is a big deal in my life. And I do run into people all the time still. I mean, I've been gone from there for a long time, but I run into people constantly that, I went there as a kid, or my parents had a cabin up there, or whatever. Right. So that still follows me everywhere. Growing up there, I was homeschooled all the way through high school. So there wasn't a school there. There is now.
But there's a school at the camp?
There is, yeah. There's enough kids there now, but when I was growing up, there were just a handful of us.
Yeah.
So my mom taught me all the way through high school.
No kidding.
I started working real young for the camp. 11 years old, I started doing work during the summers. Just manual labor, sweeping, raking needles and stuff, but out there. And early on in my time there, we were always running around the woods playing Army. We were watching Bridge over the River Kwai, all the old World War II.
We always played Marine when I was playing.
I didn't know any. I honestly, at that
time,
people make
mistakes when they're young.
Difference.
They make mistakes when they're young. It's not your fault.
So early on, my grandmother used to record programs for us because she had television. We didn't have any TV on the hill, no TV. So she would record stuff on VHS tapes and give it to us when we'd come visit her. So one of the things she recorded was a documentary from Discovery Channel on Ranger School. Wow. So I got that, I watched it 1,000 times, and I decided at probably 12 years old maybe that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to go be an Army Ranger. Right. I told my parents that, and at the time I was the kid who wouldn't make his bed, didn't follow through on anything. My dad just kind of thought,
You're really disciplined to do that.
Yeah. Right. So, but I had resolved that that's what I was going to do. So when I graduated high school, I signed up. And short step back, I met my wife, my current wife, there at Hume. We met really young at the youth group, and we've been basically together ever since then.
Were you a Christian growing up? I mean, I would imagine that influence was there, but did you have a personal relationship with Christ?
Yeah, I did. But the older I got and the closer I got to the military, the less personal it got for me. So I was saved at an early age. I believe I was probably 7 years old, I think, if that's the right number. I'm pretty bad at remembering dates and times. But definitely had a faith, believed in God, but wasn't always really living into that. So had the moral standards and the values that I've always carried with me, but having a personal relationship with Christ was not always my focus. So when I went off into the Army, went and did basic training, I was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, because I was a forward observer. Yeah. When I went to get the Ranger contract, they told me I could be a cook or a forward observer. I didn't want either of those. I wanted to go be an infantryman, but they said, we have too many of those.
Right.
So I chose forward observer. I didn't know what it was.
That was much better than choosing cook.
It was. Yeah.
For all the cooks out there, thank you for what you do.
Our cooks in the Ranger Battalion were great.
Yeah.
It's amazing that Ranger Battalion has their own cooks. I'm not sure if they still do, but back then they did. They're great guys. Yeah. But not for me. So did basic training and AIT there at Fort Sill. After that graduation, asked my wife to marry me. She said yes. So we did that at downtown Fort Sill, which if you've never visited Fort Sill, Oklahoma, it's great. I totally recommend it.
Find a piece of dirt, walk out and stand on it. That's Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
That's pretty much it.
It's a live fire range, basically, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, it was great. So did that. Went back and finished my training, did airborne school, got through RIP, which they now call RASP, but that's the selection to get into Ranger Battalion. Yeah. Got through that, got assigned to 1st Ranger Battalion, and in between those 2 points, Heather and I got married. We went back to Hume, got married, and then moved to Georgia on our own for the first time, and living in Savannah, Georgia there.
You were 19 years old, 20 years old?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 19. Yeah. So we're over there. I got deployed pretty soon after we got there. Went over to Iraq and did that. It was a good deployment. We didn't have any big tragic incidents or anything. It was just a pretty clean deployment. We were doing a lot of work, but nothing crazy. Came back, did a bunch of training in between the 2 deployments, and then went back again, this time to Afghanistan. And during that deployment, early on, almost right when we got there, found out that Heather was pregnant. Yeah. And we weren't planning on being pregnant. Yeah. It was God's plan, not ours. Sure. But we were excited about that, and turned out it was twins, which run in Heather's family, but was a big surprise, and definitely made the whole situation a little bit more nerve-wracking, because can we handle 1 kid, let alone 2?
Sure.
So came home from that deployment, and the babies were born just as we were supposed to be going on my 3rd deployment. So they gave me a little bit of a 2-week deferral, because they were due literally the day we were supposed to ship out. So they gave me a couple weeks to be home, to be a part of that, help Heather get adjusted to the babies, and then I took off. So did another deployment back into Iraq. And when I came back from that deployment, the babies are now 4 months old. At that time, Ranger Battalion was doing 90-day deployments at a time. So came back, they were 4 months old. Didn't have any idea who I was. They'd had no male contact. It was just my wife and her mom, so they were terrified of me. They wouldn't let me touch them and pick them up for a while. I cried every time I looked at them.
My son was 2 months old. My oldest son was at 4, but my oldest son was 2 months old when I came back from the deployment.
Yeah.
And it's just a weird situation.
Very weird.
Yeah. He was sleeping through the night, though, so I was thankful for that.
Miracle.
Yes.
At 2 months, that's a great thing.
But it's a weird thing.
Yeah.
You come home and there's a child there.
Yeah.
He's
big
been there for
adjustment.
a while.
Yeah. So we adjusted to that, and we were kind of gearing back up to train up and to go into another rotation. I knew at the time that I wasn't going to re-enlist. We had already talked about it a lot and determined that I was either going to keep the job or I was going to keep my family. I could just tell that the schedule of being deployed, and then when you're not deployed, you're just out training all the time.
Right.
It wasn't going to be something that was sustainable for our family. Sure. So I had made the decision, even though I did really like the work and I liked being a Ranger, I was going to get out. So I wasn't going to re-enlist. And right about that time, we were getting close to, the guys were gearing up to go again, and I was gearing up to ETS to get out. And one night we woke up, Heather woke up, and I woke up to her screaming in the front room where the babies were, and our son Asher, who was 7 months at the time, wasn't breathing. Wow. And at that point, when she found him, he was cold. So it had been a little while. So pulled him out of the crib, started attempting to do CPR on him. I had gone through CPR and stuff like that training when I was working for the camp, because I worked at one of the youth
camp. Yeah.
I was working in one of the youth camps at one point, so it was a requirement. But I couldn't, for the life of me, remember any of that. I couldn't remember anything. So I was on the phone with the dispatcher, trying to get instructions on how to do the right thing, and just, we were losing our minds. It was very traumatic. And it was 12 minutes. I found that out later, but it felt like an eternity. And then the paramedics came in and snatched our boy Asher up and took him. So we loaded up Avery, his sister, in the car, and sped off to the hospital. It was the middle of the night, and showed up at the hospital, came into the ER and started demanding, where's my son? And nobody knew what I was talking about. So we had gone to the wrong hospital. So I'm yelling at this nurse.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was yelling at her.
You're still living in
We're still in
Georgia?
Savannah, yeah. So we have no family anywhere nearby. Everybody's still back here on the West Coast. So we make it to the right hospital, and we find out that en route they had got his heart going again, and so we had this little glimmer of hope. And then they put us in this little side room that felt like a broom closet, and immediately there was a detective there, started asking us all kinds of questions, which I understand, but at the time was not what I wanted to be doing.
Right.
So we were there in the ICU for quite a few days. My parents flew out, and it became apparent that while his heart and lungs, they were keeping him going with, they were basically breathing, and he was on life support.
Yep.
There was no brain activity there. So every time they would try to unplug him from that stuff, his body would not automatically start breathing, and they were doing all kinds of scans, and there just wasn't anything there. So they basically put it to us, what are we gonna do? Do you want to try to continue to do this and just keep him alive on these machines, or are we gonna make the decision to pull the plug? So I remember in that moment feeling like, how is this decision falling to me? Like I still felt like a kid, and especially with my dad there, I didn't feel like I was ready for that kind of responsibility, but I had to make that decision, and we talked about it and prayed about it a lot, and obviously lots of tears. But we ended up deciding that they had proven to us and shown us in multiple different ways that he was gone, that he wasn't really there. It was just his body was.
How long did you have to make that decision?
You know what? I wish I could remember the amount of days. It's such a blur, but
it was a period of time.
It was days, yeah. It might have even been as long as a week before we actually made the decision. That whole time is just a blur.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
So we made the decision that we were gonna let him go, and as part of that, they asked us if we wanted to donate his organs to potentially save another child. So of course we decided, yeah, we'll do that.
That's right.
And one of the first, I feel like, glimmers of God being in that moment and saying, hey, I'm still here and I want you to know, was that this is in a strange way, but when they went to do that, they came back and told us later, they said, yeah, there was nothing we could use because it was also damaged because he'd been down so long that night before. So that was, as horrible as it is, that was reinforcement for me to know that I did know that he was gone, but that was even more reinforcement that
confirmation that you'd done the right thing.
Even if we had tried,
sure,
he wasn't gonna make it.
For sure.
So I was already close to getting out, and I still had a couple months to go. I wasn't going to deploy again, and I had a couple of really great guys in Ranger Battalion, specifically my CO at the time, that just stepped up and said, hey, give me all your gear. I signed over, I believe, like a power of attorney to him, so he could do all the paperwork for ETSing and turn all of my gear in for him, and I just left.
Wow.
He got me out on what they call a hardship discharge, so still honorable.
Yeah.
But I got out a couple of months early, and not to jump way ahead, but what that did for me that I didn't know at the time, was obviously it allowed me just to disconnect and leave and take my family and go back home and be with family. But the other thing it did is at that time, a lot of my buddies were getting out, and they were getting either stop-lost or recalled right back in. And so I honestly dodged that. I would have, if I'd have gotten out normally, I most likely would have been back in for another year somewhere else.
What year was this?
2005. Yeah. That was August 2005.
Yeah. But things were bad in 2005.
Yeah. And so I had a bunch of buddies that, got out of Ranger Battalion, were going to try to go start a new life, and then ended up doing PSYOPs in Iraq for a year. Stuff that they didn't really sign up to do. And, they went and did their duty honorably and all that, but that would not have been good for me and my family at that time. So that was another way that I saw God's hand really taking care of us in the midst of a terrible situation.
We'll continue to walk through your story and some of the struggles on the other side of that, but do you think that separating from the Army that way, although you avoided stop-loss and getting recalled, do you think it hurts you on the other side? The disconnect, there's no closure with these relationships?
Absolutely, yeah. And I have only recently been able to start reaching back out to those guys that I served with that I was really close to.
Yeah.
And start to connect with them again, because I did just take off. I honestly, I mean, I had some really close friends there, as you know how that works. And I didn't even say goodbye to most of them because I just took off.
Yeah.
And at that time, I wasn't thinking about that at all. But yeah, there was no closure. There was no hanging out at somebody's house, having a party before we went home. There was just none of that.
Yeah. You were completely isolated, separated from those guys.
Totally. It's a great question. And for a long time, for many years. And that was due to my own shortcomings, that I didn't reach out to them. But where I was at, it didn't even occur to me that that's something I should have done.
So where'd you go from there? You left
came
the
back
Army.
to California.
Yeah.
My parents were still living at Hume Lake up in the camp. We came back and moved into a house that was owned by my grandparents and my parents. So it's in Clovis, so like Fresno area.
Yeah, right.
We moved in there. We got pregnant again. We had our other son, North, and I just started working dead-end jobs, just whatever I could get. I mean, I came out of Ranger Battalion and I had no skills except for that. So
you were good at that?
My options weren't all that great. And my wife was adamant at the time that I couldn't do law enforcement because she said, I've already been worried about you, dying for the last 3 years, so you can't go do that. So that was off the table, which is what I thought I would do. But
which is what former gunfighters typically
that's what they do. It's what we do, right? So I didn't do that. So I worked a bunch of just dead-end jobs. I was doing kind of like remodeling construction, and I got involved in sales and air conditioning, just jobs that I just didn't like. And we were really starting to kind of fall apart after that. At that time,
you mean
me and
wife.
Heather.
Yeah.
So at that time, like you had brought up, I wasn't walking super strong with the Lord. I still had my faith. We weren't horrible people, but that wasn't my focus.
Yeah.
So we started, I had never been a drinker. I just grew up at Hume Lake. There's no alcohol, so I never got into that. The whole time I was in Ranger Battalion, never did. But after we lost Asher, I did start, and then that rapidly became a problem.
What caused you to start? I mean, I know the event, but why would you go to that?
I was running away from it. I didn't want to deal with it. When we first got back, just as an example of that, my parents and other people started talking to us about, let's do a memorial, let's have a funeral, and let's do those things. And we started to plan one, and it was so overwhelming for me. I just said, I'm not doing it. We're just not going to do it. And we never did. So we basically just stopped talking about it, and
moved on.
We never dealt with it. We didn't see a counselor. We didn't talk to anybody about it. We just tried to move on, which was the worst possible thing you could do because it never goes away.
What was your wife doing during all this?
She was doing her best to raise the kids and take care of them, and she didn't have to work. I was making just enough money that she didn't have to work, and that was only because we were living in a house that we weren't paying for.
Sure.
So she was taking care of the kids and dealing with the fact that I was being, a distant.
Did she have family around, or
her family was close? Yeah, her family lives in Kingsburg, which is just south of Fresno area. So her family and sister were close. So we did have. I don't want to make it sound like we didn't have any support from our families, because we did. Yeah. The choice to not deal with it was our choice alone.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that whole chain of events started, and not dealing with it, not going to God with it, not attending church, and then instead choosing alcohol to not deal with it was obviously, where that path goes. Sure, it's just going to be detrimental. So we were just kind of struggling along, not doing great. And I talked to my dad after I've been doing that for about 3 years, and I just said, I feel totally unfulfilled in this job. I can't keep doing this. I need to do something. I specifically told him I want that camaraderie back that I had in Ranger Battalion that in the civilian world is very hard to find. So he told me at that time, he said, why don't you go be a fireman? I know some firemen, and they seem to be home a lot, and they seem to like their jobs, and I have this buddy, and why don't you go talk to him? So I never thought about being a fireman before. I went and talked to him, and he had me convinced in 5 minutes that it was the job that I should pursue. So started working on that, and through a chain of events that I don't need to go into entirely, I was trying to get hired there in Fresno. I had some buddies that were doing that, and we're going to work there, and my family was there, so it just seemed to make sense.
Right.
I also applied for Los Angeles County, where this friend of my dad's, now also a friend of mine, worked, just because he said, you have to apply for the county. It's the best department in the nation. And so, okay, I'll apply. I had no interest in working or living in Southern California. But through a chain of events with hiring and budgets, I was about to get hired with Fresno City, And then literally 2 weeks before that was supposed to happen, they canceled all that and didn't hire anybody for years after that. And then the county hired me right shortly after that. Wow. So we moved down here and moved actually down to Murrieta is where we moved. I literally knew so little about Southern California that I just kind of pictured it as all being like the same area. Right. And we had family friends that had a place we could come stay because I wasn't making a ton of money. I couldn't buy a place, but we knew we had to come down. I had to go to the tower. So I'm like, yeah, Murrieta, that seems like it's close enough. I had no idea.
It looks close on the map.
It does. I had no idea it was going to be an hour and a half drive to where the training tower was, but it was perfect. The place we were at, it was actually up on the plateau. Yeah. So kind of out of the city, and which growing up in the mountains, I crave that kind of thing. Yeah, so started the tower, and it's a stressful time. It's nothing like going through any training in the military. Obviously, it's not that intense, but it's pretty in-depth, and it takes a while to get through it.
And we have a family and the other issues you're dealing with, right?
Yeah. So the issues during that time just continued to compound, and I was to the point where I was still drinking a lot, and I was being really irresponsible with money. At one point, we even had our car repossessed. Like, it was that bad. And so my life at home was just falling apart. Right. And Heather and I were growing farther and farther away. And through a bunch of other events that happened that I won't go into right now, it came to a point where I realized I have to stop drinking. Like, right now, it has to stop. And so I made the decision, and I quit, and I haven't since. Yeah. It's been like 8 years. Wow. So that was kind of like my first step back in a positive direction, because things in the home are falling apart so bad. I made that decision, and Heather and I started slowly working through our problems. I started going to church. I was so desperate for something at that point that I was going to like 3 different services every Sunday by myself, just because I needed something, and that's the only thing I knew to look for. So I started going back, leaning into that. We started talking to a Christian therapist and started getting some help for the marriage, and so things started to look up. And about that time, just a small side note, we lost my cousin Mike Haynes. He had grown up with me at Hume. We'd lived together for a bunch of years. He'd gone off into the Army also, and then was highway patrol in Montana. He got killed by a drunk driver on duty, which was a big loss for me because we were very close. Sure. So that happened. We also lost another cousin of mine, Wade. Ended up taking his own life. So there were these other events that were happening that were compounding on the traumatic loss of our son, which we still weren't dealing with. So that's all going on, but things are starting to get better. And then we get pregnant again. Also unexpected, not planned. And it was
always is.
Yeah, it was awesome. God knew. But we were terrified. And then we found out it was going to be twins again, which was even more terrifying. Wow. And we were excited, but also just very afraid, that the same thing was going to happen again. And 6 months into that process, we went in for just a routine ultrasound, and the ultrasound technician is doing her thing, and then she's like, hold on. And she leaves the room, and I immediately knew something was wrong. She came back in, and she's like, hey, this one baby, I think they called it baby B, is passed away. He's not there anymore. So now we don't know what to do. They're telling us that now there's a huge risk for our other baby that's still there, that he might not make it because his brother had passed. So I remember walking out of that hospital. We were at Loma Linda, which is like in Redlands, coming out on the grass, and Heather and I are just a wreck. And our older kids who had been in the waiting room, Avery and North, are like, what's going on? And so I had to tell them, you can't make them wait. I had to tell them right there, just in the middle of this grass field in front of the hospital, that their brother had passed. So that was super difficult. And it wasn't too long after that then there were some complications. Then Heather was hospitalized. And then as part of that, Indy, his name's Indigo, had to be delivered emergency C-section because things were just going south and it didn't look like he was going to make it. So he came out about 2 months early. He weighed 2 pounds 8 ounces. Good night. Which is, he was tiny. Wow. He couldn't believe that he had, that he was alive. Like, it was amazing. And they told us right from the beginning, they said, this is this is going to be a fight. This isn't a guarantee that he very, very well may die. And if he does make it, they told us he will almost certainly have some sort of deficits, mental or physical. He won't be a normal kid, which, amongst all that other stuff, obviously that doesn't matter. You just want him to survive. But at the same time, it's a huge way to just try to imagine what the future is going to be like. And so we were in the NICU for almost 2 months. And side note about the fire service and the brotherhood that I had found there, I had actually become somewhat jaded to that because I hadn't found the camaraderie that I had in the Ranger Battalion. It's just not the same. Nothing can be. But I really opened my eyes during that event because I needed to be there constantly. And the guys at my station just said, hey, don't worry about it. You're off. We'll take care of it. And I had guys working my days as what we call trades, but trades that I would never have to pay back. And a ton of them were trades that I wouldn't even be able to pay back because it was captains working in my spot as a fireman. I can never work for that guy. And so he was just doing that out of the kindness of his heart so I could be there with my family.
Wow.
So it was a really amazing time.
Wow.
A lot of guys came and brought food, and we were staying in the Ronald McDonald House at the time because we lived so far away from the hospital. So we're living in this bizarre situation with our kids, and we're in and out of the hospital constantly. And it was a really difficult time, but it was also a time where I really did see like that brotherhood and God's hand in that, really saying, I still care for you guys. I'm still here.
Yeah.
So flash forward, just to tie that off, Indy is now 5 and he's healthy. He's the happiest kid you'll ever meet. He runs around. He's a wild man. He doesn't appear to have any deficits at all, except that he's small.
Right.
So like if you look at the growth charts, he's on the small end,
right, which
we don't care about at all.
Sure.
Like he's a little wild man. So that's a big praise. Awesome. We are thankful for that every day. Shortly after that happened, my brother-in-law, Cody, who is married to my middle sister, Emily, he's a fireman out in Colorado, and we've known for quite a few years at this point that he had a brain tumor, and they've been working on different ways to deal with it, and it'd just been kind of being watched, and it had started growing again, and so they were concerned, and they decided they were going to have to go in and remove it. And he made it through the surgery, went home, we were talking to him, everything seemed to be okay, and then one day things just totally went south, and he just never woke up. He passed away from complications from that. So that happened, which was a big loss for the whole family. But Cody and I had grown pretty close as firemen. We would talk all the time, and we were really like-minded in a lot of the ways we looked at the job and family and stuff. And so that was another big hit. Obviously, for me, much smaller than like for my sister and her. They have 5 kids, but still, that kind of thing. Just then, for the way I look at it now, it just added to everything else that I was carrying. So now we're getting closer to where I finally did go to Mighty Oaks. And when I had come back, a friend of mine, Morgan Cheney, had mentioned it through his wife to my wife that, hey, this program is really good. He had gone, and Nole should go. And I'm like, whatever.
Right.
I don't need that.
I'll be okay.
I'm doing fine.
I'm fine.
I'm doing fine.
Nothing traumatic has happened in my life.
I don't need that. And the way I looked at it then at that time, honestly, is I didn't have the moment in combat where my buddy got blown away next to me or an IED went off on half of my, I didn't have that moment. And so I felt like, I'm fine. Like I didn't do that. I'm okay. I've got these struggles, but it's got nothing to do with post-traumatic stress. So that's kind of my mindset. But I started noticing as more time goes on and Indy's getting a little older that I'm having a really hard time focusing on my wife, being there for her. I can't seem to bring myself to get down on the ground and play with Indy, even though he's always begging me to play with him. I just can't do it. I can't connect with my kids, and I'm starting to feel really bad that I'm not being the husband and father that I want to be. And it's not because I don't want to be, it's because I really feel like I can't. And I don't know what's going on, but I'm struggling. And another friend of ours, Mike Caldwell, knows the program. He hasn't been, but he knows the program through somebody that works for you guys, and didn't even mention it to me. They talked to my wife about it, but they got me a pamphlet, got me one of your little trifold pamphlets, and I looked at it.
The glossy trifold, yes.
And I thought, I don't know, but I really felt like, all right, you're being called here. This is something you got to go do. So I reached out. I did the online forums, and I got in touch with Brandon and started the process, put a date on the calendar. I was trying to bring a couple of my friends along with me from the fire department so that I would have some friends with me. But scheduling 3 guys in their schedules, and it just wasn't working. So I finally just decided, you know what, I'm just going to go do this by myself. And then once I had made that decision and there was a date on the calendar, then I started feeling really nervous about it. And we talked about this a little bit before we started, but I started honestly worrying that what if I'm the only guy that's at this thing that doesn't have that moment in combat where that's what gave me PTS. And I didn't want to be the only guy there that didn't have that. So because of my pride.
Sure. Yeah.
I was proud of what I had done, but I was like, my stuff is all different. So I told...
On that point, before you go on, I think it's always amazing how we measure ourselves against other people.
Yeah.
So for, kind of non-military people, like you were with 1st Ranger Battalion, you deployed to combat twice, you did the thing. So then for you to go, well, I didn't do anything.
It wasn't enough.
It wasn't that big a deal. Yeah. I don't want to be in a place where I'm the only one.
Yeah.
It's crazy how much damage we do to ourselves by comparing our story with someone else's story, right?
Yeah.
But sorry. Go ahead. I always find that fascinating. It doesn't matter where you came from. There's always somebody else.
There's always somebody else, and you can't live your life comparing yourself to that person because they don't really exist.
Right.
I mean, they do, but you know what I mean. So I emailed Brandon at one point. I was like, "Hey, man, I'm going to be out. I don't think this is for me," and he didn't respond to me. And then I'm thinking about it, I'm praying about it, and talking to Heather. And I'm like, okay, I just need to do this. So then I emailed him back, and so I'm back in. I waffled back and forth a lot. So I get on the plane, and I'm flying out to Ohio, going to the wilds, and my first experience with that place was, pulling into it. It's beautiful. It's an amazing location, and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. This is a really nice facility, and everybody was nice, and it was Brandon that picked me up, and he was a little serious, but I liked that. And I was instantly in the van with other guys that were on the plane, and we were already starting to hit it off, and I was thinking, this might be okay. And then I ended up in this dorm, one of the buildings, it's not a dorm, one of the cabins. And I get in my room, and there's already another gentleman in there, and I was immediately... He's probably going to watch this. So he was clearly, he won't mind me saying this. He was clearly suffering, and he was broken, and I could tell immediately. And he was in there, he was taking a nap, and I was just immediately like, oh no, this is going to be my bunkmate for this week. And I was bummed out. Yeah. I'm going to just fast forward to capture his arc of the story. Over the week that we were there, I watched that guy turn into a completely different man. I watched him transform entirely to where he was walking and talking differently. He looked physically different because he surrendered. He gave up what he was carrying, and he started pursuing God again. And you could physically see it in his face, and you could hear it in his voice. It was amazing. It was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. It's awesome. I've seen a lot of stuff. Yeah. So that was really cool. And we're friends now. We talk, and he's just a really good dude. Got a great family. So that's an overarching, outside of my experience there, what I saw. But to go back to my concern about being, my traumas from something else, I'm just a first responder now. None of that obviously came to fruition there. It was never like that. The leadership there was very professional, and it was never about, oh, this is what I did. And it wasn't about that at all. And I felt very comfortable while at the same time being stretched and feeling uncomfortable, if that makes sense, because we're obviously walking through difficult stuff and dealing with difficult things, but it wasn't ever like I felt like I shouldn't be there. I felt like I belonged, and it was that aspect of it, and of the guys that were there running the thing. It was very professional and very well done. Provided an environment where I could be really open and share and feel like I wasn't being judged, right? And that we were all just working together to try to be able to be better and go home and be the men we wanted to be.
Because every guy there was probably comparing themselves and their stories as well. Yeah, it's interesting what you find in life or at a Mighty Oaks program, anywhere you have the opportunity to talk through it, is that most of us are struggling with things that we're not identifying. The real struggle is not the combat thing or the, whatever. It's a series of events. It's something that happened a long time ago that we haven't thought about, or that we try to pack away, or that we haven't dealt with. So yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. For me specifically, the thing that I learned, because I went there, I had kind of read enough, and I'd read some books on post-traumatic stress disorder, and I had kind of realized, even though I didn't want to, that I was struggling with a lot of the same signs and symptoms of that.
Sure.
I was dealing with a lot of that stuff, and so I was hoping to go there and just get some tools to figure out how to work on it. And I got a lot of really valuable stuff out of the curriculum that you could consider tools to work on that. But the thing that I really learned most of all was that I had been carrying the death of our sons and the death of Mike and Cody and all that stuff, and I'd been trying to do it by myself. I hadn't given it to God. I was doing it on my own.
Right.
And the moment that I realized that actually came, we were one night just hanging out in the dorm, and we were with our I forget what they called him, but the
team leader.
The team leader, yeah. Awesome dude. And we were just kind of talking about what we had learned that day and praying. And one of the guys there, we were praying over one of the other guys. I'm trying to be super broad here and not
give me names and pictures.
No names. He's praying over this other guy, and this gentleman was very, without getting weird, he felt like he had a vision for this man, the man that transformed totally. And so he told him that. He said, God is telling me to tell you this right now. And I'd been in situations kind of like that before. I mean, I grew up in a Christian camp, but it still feels a little bit foreign and like, oh, I don't know about this. Right. And then after he was done with that, I wasn't really involved in that part of the conversation, but I was in the room. We were praying over the guy. And then he said, Nole, I feel like I have a word for you too. And he told me that he said he felt like God was wanted him to tell me that he was there with me when Asher died. And that seems really small and insignificant because, of course, if you grew up believing in God, you believe that he's everywhere all the time, right? And I know that. I do believe that. Yeah. But in that moment, I had this really weird moment of clarity where I could picture myself in that apartment. I could see everything. It was like I was there again. And I'd remembered that moment many times. But in that moment, I could see that while I'm down there trying and failing to do CPR on my boy, Jesus was right there in this like vision that I had. And it was a really earth-shattering moment for me because I realized that my whole life up until that point, I had been carrying this guilt that I didn't save my son because I couldn't remember CPR. And I'd been carrying that. And I think I told maybe one other person, I think I told Heather, that I felt that way. But I felt like if I could have just remembered how to do CPR properly, maybe he would have made it. And that it was all on me, and that I had failed in that moment. And I was just by myself in that version of my remembering the event. So through that, I realized that I wasn't alone, and that God didn't intend me to carry that alone, that he was walking alongside me through all those burdens and feeling that pain with me. Yeah. And I realized through the other rest of the curriculum that really what I needed to do was shift my focus away from just, I'm trying to be a better husband and father and fireman, and I'm trying to do all these things. And really the first thing I needed to be doing was the thing that I knew from my growing up already, was that I needed to be focusing first on my relationship with Christ, and that I just really hadn't done it. I mean, there were times in my life where I started working in that direction, but I just hadn't ever made it like that's my focus now. Yeah. And so that was the biggest thing that I took away from my time there, was like I really have to lean into this and focus on that first. Right. And then everything else will follow in behind that.
Yeah, what a great takeaway. I just had this conversation this week with someone about marriage and how people will say, or they'll ask, how can I have a godly marriage? Or how can we have a good marriage? And they'll ask those questions. Those are valid questions. But over the years, I've learned that the answer is you need to stop asking how to have a godly marriage or how to have a good marriage, and start asking, how can I be a godly person? Yeah. Because if my focus is on God, then my marriage will be right and those other relationships will be right. I think we spend so much time focusing on the like mechanically, like how do I put the pieces together to make this thing work? When really it's just focusing on God. Yeah. It changes everything.
It does. Yeah. It does. And especially coming from a man like me, and I'm sure like a lot of guys, we're problem solvers and we want to focus on the thing and fix the thing.
Right.
And you're like, no, you actually have to look beyond that.
Right.
And not focus on that.
Yeah. That thing is not your responsibility.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's hard to let go of. So after I came back from Mighty Oaks, I was floored. I was very excited, and I'm sure a lot of guys are. Yeah. I had all these notes. I was super nervous.
It's always exciting till you get home and your wife's standing there, and then
I was super nervous about having that conversation with my wife. I'm like, I've gone through so much in this last week, so I literally was like writing notes down about how to talk to her about it. She was very supportive, and for the next few months, I just went front to back through that book of all the curriculum and all my notes, and I was studying it, and it's been about a year since I got back, just over a year, and I'm still dealing with that stuff. Obviously, things are much better, but I do still find myself drifting back into those old patterns of I'm just going to get by on my own, and I have to take a minute. And sometimes it's a rude awakening where I'm like, hold on, I'm going back to that old. I'm just going to handle this where I need to take it to God and really focus on that first. And so I know that that'll be a lifelong journey, but that's kind of where we're at.
How has your wife responded to you coming home and some of the things you've put in place, and how has she dealt with the last year?
I think, and we're still in a place where we're working on a lot of the past issues that we've gone through, and we are still honestly, and we may always be, but we still struggle at times with the loss of Asher and Paxton, our sons.
Of course.
Especially because, Avery, who's Asher's sister, she's 15 now. And there's a lot of moments where you see her doing something and your mind just goes to, what would Asher be like? What would he be doing right now? You can't help that. And we have struggled a lot with, in those moments, sharing those with each other. I've just kind of recently, not discovered, I've kind of known it, but we've talked about it now, where it's like I'll be thinking about that, and it'll make me feel sad, but it's not like a crippling sadness. It's just you're recognizing that missing piece or that loss, but I won't share it with Heather because I don't want to make her sad. And I think something that we've realized in that realm lately is that that's just silly. Like, if I bring up
to not share it.
If I bring up Asher, I'm not going to crush her and ruin her day. Chances are she's probably thinking about it too, or she has in the last week, and we should probably talk about it and be more open about it, because the flip side of that is I'm thinking about that, so my face may change a little bit. I might get a little bit shorter with her or the kids, and she doesn't know why. Now she thinks there's something wrong. Yeah. We get into an argument, and now it's like, well, I'm upset about this, but now we're down that road. So we are still dealing with that and trying to figure out what to do about it. I would love to get Heather to the female version of Mighty Oaks.
The women's program, right?
We've talked about it a lot, and I was actively pursuing it, and then COVID happened and everything changed, and that's just an excuse at this point. I just needed to do it because I think she would also get a lot out of it.
It's continuing to grow together. And
so we're definitely we haven't fully figured that part of it out yet, and we're still, even all these years later, trying to learn to talk about the loss of the boys and deal with it head on, rather than just kind of not talking about it.
Let me ask you a question that you don't have to answer if you don't want to. And you can tell me you don't want to answer it. I've never lost a child. I have 4 kids. I can't imagine the pain of losing a child. But I have lost friends, and I've lost other family members. And I'm not saying it's the same, but that's my connection to that type of loss. However, when it's a child, and I can imagine a young child, the connection is just different than if it's 1 or even 2 people removed. With the ability to look back and to think over the last 15 or more years, understanding that you're leaning into God, and how do you reconcile? And this is for people that would say, I've lost a child, I've lost a loved one, I've lost a lot. I want to have faith, I want to believe in God, but I struggle with reconciling these two things. How do you reconcile the loss of a child or children, the other struggles that you've had, and the love of God and the care for God, and that thought or that vision, that understanding that God's with you through all of that? How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, that is the question. And I've watched friends and acquaintances walk away from the faith because of that question. Maybe not specifically because they lost a kid, but they lost a spouse or some other tragedy happened, and they just can't reconcile that with, well, I believe that God is good and that he loves us. So how did he allow this? Sure. I totally get that. And I've thought about that a lot. I don't know that I have I do know. I don't have all the right answers.
You might have all the right answers, but you're not sure.
The way that I have chosen at this point to look at that is I believe that God he's real, he's in control, and he knows what's going on. I believe that he's present and he's active in our lives. I don't believe that he's just distant and just kind of set us on a path and is just watching.
He's watching, yeah.
I believe he's in control. The problem with that, from my perspective, is if I believe he's in control, then he either knew that Asher was going to die, or he didn't do anything about it, or he didn't know, which in that case he's not in control. But I believe he's in control, which means that he knew and allowed it to happen. Right. I reconcile with that, and even I struggle with it still. But the way that I look at it is, God doesn't operate in time like we do.
That's good.
He's eternal.
That's good.
And so he's looking at my life and the struggles that I go through from his perspective that I'll never understand. So if I believe that God is big enough to have created the world, to create all the stuff that makes this table, that puts us together, which I can't understand, let alone begin to be able to do myself.
Right.
If I have that level of faith in him, then I have to know that I can't look at the way he's choosing to let things happen in my life and judge them as bad or good. While I do believe that if, God's plan for the earth had not been spoiled by, the initial sin and things would be different, but that's not the world I live in. So while I do think that when we lost Asher, when you lost family members or buddies, he walks with you in that sorrow and he is devastated by that and weeps with you. The example of him crying when Lazarus dies, even though he knows he's going to bring Lazarus back, he also knows that eventually Lazarus will die for a final time. Yeah. And he weeps with his disciples in that. So all that to say, I believe that God looks at time and this tiny little blip on the timeline, which is my life and the things that I go through in that, differently than I do, because he can see eternity and he knows what happens after I'm gone, after I've passed on and I'm out of this world, where I will now be, I believe, in heaven with Jesus and living into that, however that looks. And I don't know, but I also kind of cling to, and this isn't, I will disclaimer, I know this isn't like really sound theology, but C.S. Lewis talks about it in, I think it's The Great Divorce. I'm probably wrong, but he talks about how he believes that when you get to heaven, that God then takes everything that happened in your life and you kind of work backwards. It works backward through, I'm going to state that wrong. Let me start over. When you're in heaven, heaven works backwards through time, and suddenly when you look at your timeline, everything is heaven. You were always there, type of idea. So because God operates in eternity, that timeline is now, once you're in that timeline with him, everything is that timeline. In addition to that, well, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that's a really important conversation. And even in terms of redemption, redeeming your story and the story of your family to help other people, to put that in perspective. But yeah, you're right. God just doesn't operate in the same timeline we do.
And he looks at suffering differently.
He looks at suffering
because he can see the big picture. And I did resign myself early on to the fact that I would probably in this life never know why that happened. Because I did have people, well-meaning people, say to me, someday you're going to be able to help someone, or you're going to have this impact. And I didn't like that. I'm like, I don't care. Give me my boy back. That person, I don't care about what's going to happen with that. And I do strongly believe that I will probably never know in this lifetime why that happened.
And certainly that is the case. That's terrible advice to give to someone.
It is.
It is a sincere desire to comfort.
But it's
But it's terrible. Hebrews 11, I always go back to that, where it talks about those who had faith and then they wandered in the wilderness naked, they were tormented, they were sawn asunder, all these things happened. And they never knew why.
They never knew why.
And I don't think we'll ever know why. But the comfort that God does provide comfort because he loves us. That example of Lazarus is great, but I think he wept as much for the people that were weeping.
Right, for their pain.
Right.
Absolutely.
Even knowing that there was a bigger plan.
Yeah.
And God knows the bigger plan, but he's also touched by the feelings of our infirmities.
Yeah,
and
he feels it.
It's something we can't understand, but we have to lean into.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's
great.
getting okay with that I don't understand part that's so difficult for a lot of us. And even still, I struggle with it.
Of course.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change who God is.
Right.
We just got a couple minutes, so a lot of things we could talk about. But one thing I wanted to get to with you, is this part. First responders and their need for. I don't like for this show to always be about us. Like it's not a pitch for Mighty Oaks, right? But programs like Mighty Oaks, faith-based solutions to trauma and difficulty and trial. I don't think people always understand. I know they don't always understand many of the unique challenges of being in either law enforcement or the fire service, those first responder roles. Can you talk to that for a minute? Kind of the unique challenge, and then why a non-clinical point to God approach is helpful.
Yeah, not only helpful, but I believe it's completely necessary and something that we've got to get more of our guys plugged into. I was on the job maybe a year. This is after losing our son. And I show up first on scene with one other fireman. We were in a little mini truck that one of our stations had, so it's just two of us on scene. Came in as a sick person, which is normally no big deal.
Right.
Literally just someone with the flu.
Sure.
We pulled up. Here's his dad, and he's got a baby.
No way.
And baby's 7 months old and is not breathing. So now me and my buddy are in the middle of this cul-de-sac on the pavement trying to do CPR on this baby. So you don't see that every day, but the reality of being a police officer who often ends up on scene first for stuff like that, or a firefighter or a paramedic on an ambulance, all those jobs, you will see stuff like that. And everybody's going to handle it differently, but what I believe is that you start carrying those things with you and they start stacking on top of one another. And so if you have a career in, for my example, the fire service, and you've seen that, and then a couple of years later you have a 3-year-old who drowned, and then just a few shifts ago we had a 16-year-old that had a full arrest and passed away. Oh. And so you're part of those things, and you're seeing those things. And then you go back to the station, and it's not talked about usually. There are stations that handle it a little better than others, but most of the time we're all type A personalities. We don't want to show our weaknesses and say, man, that was hard. I'm thinking about my kids now, and I'm having a hard time with that. We just kind of shove it on the table. We gallows humor it up, and we move on. Yeah. But you start carrying those things, and we've seen in the fire service specifically the last, I might misspeak here, but the last 2 years, we've had more firefighters in the United States take their lives than we have lost in fires, actively fighting fire. Right. So I
think last year was 180. I think is the number.
Yeah. I believe
fire service suicides.
Right, and I believe that's right. And that's not just us. That's also in law enforcement communities. Sure. They're experiencing the same thing.
They're both very high. What's interesting, to your point, is that's with 40% underreporting.
Yeah.
Because it's a different world. I've talked about that before, but it's extremely high.
Yeah, we've had a few. We probably shouldn't go too deep into that, but we have had a few where it doesn't get reported as what it actually is, which is, I believe, what you're saying. That's right. Yeah, so it's higher. Yeah. So where can a program like Mighty Oaks have an effect on that? I've experienced it firsthand, and obviously I came from a background of faith, but to take a step back, I did see when I was at Mighty Oaks, I don't know what everyone's faith background was there, but I do know that there was one individual who was not. He had no faith background and was very vocal about not wanting to have anything to do with it, and was, we'll just say, a little bit adversarial to the whole thing at the beginning. Yeah. By the end, he didn't get baptized or accept Jesus at that moment, but you could tell and you could hear he was talking differently. He had also changed, and he had gotten positive things out of the program. Yeah. And that's, we were just talking about this a few days ago, about how it's interesting that the truths that are in the Bible that God put in there, a lot of those truths you can apply to your life regardless of your system of belief, and they will be beneficial. Obviously, as a Christian, I believe that you should probably accept God and start living.
There's an eternal component to a relationship with God, but truth is truth.
It is, and so it does function that way, which is pretty interesting to me. So our department is doing a good job of identifying that it's a problem, and we have all kinds of different avenues now that we didn't have when I got hired 10 years ago. So there are ways to reach out and get help, and the department is trying to do those things, but it's not like what you're talking about, a non-clinical environment where you're with other guys that are struggling with the same thing. I think that environment that you create there is so beneficial because it allows guys to see, hey, Jeremy's being really vulnerable right now and sharing, and that I identify with a lot of what he's saying. Now I feel comfortable, and I can share, and that can do nothing but help.
Yeah, if you can create that in a department or through the system, you wouldn't have to carry that for years before you find yourself in Ohio or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're my buddy Kevin and I are specifically trying to have an impact on that. We started a podcast, and one of our primary goals was to be open and be vulnerable about some of the things we struggle with, and then some of the successes that we've had dealing with it or not, and just being an example that, hey, when we have these conversations around the table at the firehouse and we're open and we discuss it, everybody benefits, and nobody ever goes away from that and says, oh, I wish those guys hadn't talked about that. It's always very positive. But getting guys to that point is difficult, especially in the fire service, and I'm sure it's the same in law enforcement and everywhere else, where nobody wants to be vulnerable and open. We all have our guard up, and everybody's super tough, and so that's something that we're working on.
That's awesome.
Off to the side. The way that started was kind of bizarre. I listen to podcasts all the time because I have a very long drive, and I'd been feeling like I should do this. Really feeling called to do it, but I felt like I don't really have a voice in this. There's guys that are doing it really well, but it was really bothering me for a long time. And I pulled my buddy Kevin aside one time. I was like, hey man, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? And he was like, I've been feeling the same way for months. And so anyway, that's kind of awesome. That's kind of how it started.
I'm really glad to see folks in the first responder community doing that. We need to put this in the, so if you're listening and not watching, go to YouTube. We'll put a comment in there with some of the links to. We've made some good friends over the years who have podcasts and other things that helps to specifically to the first responder community. But your podcast is called
The Fire You Carry.
The Fire You Carry.
Yeah.
And where can people find it and listen to it?
We're on all the major stuff now. We're on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, it'll come up. And
what are some of the things, like real quick, like some topics you hit?
So far, we just had a great conversation with a buddy of mine who had lost his mom real young. So we talk about, in that episode, we talk specifically about some things you can do to walk alongside somebody who has experienced a loss.
Right.
So
that's great.
We don't go too deep into like the things not to say, but we do talk about those issues.
How to walk through that with
somebody. How to walk through that with somebody, which is honestly, that's unknown territory for most of us. And it's such an uncomfortable time that a lot of us just distance ourselves from that, which is the worst thing you can do. But so we talk about that. We do also honestly talk a lot about fitness stuff and other things that we do in our lives that are also beneficial to just keeping the mental health aspect up. But we talk about that. We've got some good episodes coming up with some guys that struggle with PTSD from various things, and so we're definitely leaning in that direction. We're only 2 months old, so there's not a ton of content on there. Probably the best one so far, we had a 2-hour-long conversation with my dad, who's a pastor in Fullerton.
That's awesome.
And we talk about a wide range of topics, but he's got a lifetime of experience and stories. And
that's awesome. You guys have social media connected to the podcast?
Yeah, so we do have a group on Facebook that we're just trying to get rolling. My buddy Kevin does have us up on Instagram, and I believe it's under just The Fire You Carry. I'm not on Instagram.
Yeah.
But you can find us there.
Awesome, man. Yeah. Check it out. Go listen to those for sure. The great thing about content like that, shows like this and podcasts and other content, is you can share them out to people that need them.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the most valuable part.
Yeah.
Whether I care about some of those conversations or not, I know someone who does.
Yeah, absolutely.
So awesome. Thanks for coming down.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for talking with us.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll do it again. In fact, I think you're going to be back in our studio in a couple weeks, right?
We're coming down. We're going to interview. We're going to interview.
You're going to do your podcast here.
Yeah.
With Brandon.
Yeah. Are you going to be here that day?
That'll be interesting. We'll see. Maybe we'll make
Get you
that
on there
happen.
too.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Try to make it happen.
Yeah.
But thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
thanks for what you guys are doing. For those of you that are watching, thanks for watching. Again, subscribe, like, send this content out. Will be helpful to someone. If you are listening somewhere, go to YouTube and check it out there. Thank you, and we will talk to you next time.